Saturn in the natal chart is where we feel our restrictions. It is where our area in which we need to grow, mature, to get rid of our self-limiting beliefs, and turn it around into productivity, the material world, and where we can basically stabilize ourselves. A big keyword of Saturn is stability, this is where we find our stability, and this is where we find our sometimes limiting beliefs of ourselves. This is where our limit is. This is where we feel comfortable, Saturn in the first house people feel comfortable limiting themselves. This is the area in which they limit themselves is literally themselves. So Saturn ascendant people they have a lot of control over their lives, because they can control how they appear to others, and it's usually in a way in which is somewhat deprived. A lot of Saturn first house people are very thin, physically fit, because they do the work to improve themselves. They're always improving themselves. There's always more improvement to be done with Saturn on the ascendant or Saturn in the first house. I'm jealous of people with Saturn in their first house, because this is very productive and very good for making it in the material world. The second house, Saturn in the second house, I have this one. It's your materials, your material possession, your money, and people with limitation in this house can self-limit themselves, self-limit the money coming in. The material world they may have a very dark or negative view on the material world, or they may just not really give a shit about money or cars or any material things. The attitude about this with Saturn here is basically isn't really a concern. It depends on which house Saturn. I mean, it depends on which sign Saturn is in this house, and then the rulers, and then it's a little more complicated. I mean, every Saturn in every house has its own aspects tied to it, or its own certain rulership. And then that's in another house, and then it just goes from there. Another one, Saturn in the third house is kind of like your social contacts, and networking with others, and has a lot to do with the way you think. And Saturn third house people sometimes think very negatively about the world, very negatively about their environments, and people with Saturn in the third, I notice, have kind of a limiting belief of thought process, and is not really willing to budge on changing that thought process, which was negatively brought to the person from early life. The fourth house, Saturn in the fourth house, family brought a lot of burdens. Family life brought a lot of burdens to this native. It was hell to participate in family matters. Just quite a burden. And feels pretty comfortable in the home life, kind of doesn't want to move from that, and may be somewhat reserved in dealing with anything kind of outside of the roots or foundation. The fifth house, Saturn in the fifth house, oh my goodness, I see so many people with Saturn in the 5th house have struggles and struggles and struggles in their relationships, in their creativity, in their expression. They limit their self-expression because that is comfortable to them. They don't like dancing. They may limit themselves from they may feel awkward at parties, socially awkward at parties, and they can be very reserved in their relationships, to open up, shy to open up to relationships, or they just like to have a very stable relationship and not go much further from there. May marry young, may have children young. Saturn in the 6th house is like the daily routine and health. So Saturn here would bring either a purification of the things in this house, or it could bring struggles and challenges to this area, like health problems, or a bad habit that is hard to kick, or anything like having to do with the health, matters of the health. Saturn in the 7th house. Some of these people do not really like to be in a committed partnership because it feels like way too much of a burden. I use the word burden a lot. Saturn brings burdens, heavy burdens. Saturn in the 7th house people could end up marrying a darker. Somewhere I heard that the partners of a Saturn 7th house tend to be dark, maybe darker skinned, maybe dark in their expression, but Saturn in the 7th house is a very heavy placement, and marriages and partnerships in this house can feel like a heavy burden, or the person can feel like, why am I never finding anybody? And Saturn, because Saturn is so limiting and so stuck in its ways, it's really difficult to break out of that and come out of that cycle. Saturn in the 8th house, that's money, and materials, kind of like the 2nd house, but it also sometimes has to do with death and inheritances. This can either be like to your benefit, having Saturn in this house, because you can be productive and get a lot done, and in your money, you can, if you work hard, you can get those resources. But sometimes it brings a limiting belief about money. Saturn in the 9th house this is your structure of education, and you would have a big structure of education here, a stable structure of communication, a stable structure of education. But this could also mean that there are challenges to how you are educated, or maybe a late or delayed education, and then the 10th house, Saturn in the 10th house is like your work and your public standing, like how are you in your career, and Saturn here would be very motivated to have a stable career. And then the 11th house, Saturn in the 11th house, would be your social groups that you belong to. If Saturn is in this house, burdens are being brought to this house, or stability, depending on what Saturn is like in your chart. If Saturn is it works well here, then you can have like a solid group of friends that you're not really set on losing, and they're there, stable. Saturn in the 12th house. This is tough. Saturn in the 12th house. I feel particularly sorry for people with displacement. It's not always bad because you can you can kind of avoid the outside world with this, and the work is done internally more so than like Saturn in the Ascendant, which you're held responsible for your environment. But Saturn in the 12th house people are very reserved, very comfortable with not putting themselves out there with their work. Maybe this is a good placement for maybe artists who prefer to work away from other people. But this 12th house, the 12th house is generally has to do with jails, hospitals, and I remember actually when Saturn was in my 12th house, it was very limiting, very annoying at the time, but Saturn in the 12th house is good for working alone, getting things done kind of like in a hospital or setting, or in a faraway place, very secluded. When I think of Saturn in the 12th house, I think of people going somewhere that's kind of remote, not much going on, to kind of figure themselves out, rehabilitation, something of that kind. And that's pretty much Saturn in the houses, and how we limit ourselves with Saturn. So if you have any questions, message me, email me. I'm always open to answering questions. Thank you.